Okay, we'd like to welcome John Horrigan here to talk to us about the Great Hurricane of 1938. Probably none of you remember that, but have heard about it, so thank you, John.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon. Thank you to Norfolk Community Television as well. Well, today's lecture is on the Great Hurricane of 1938, and as I look around the room, I'm a bit disappointed that nobody was around back in 1938. You're way too young. You know about me, blah, 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 the folklorist, Emmy Awards, etc., etc. 28 nominations, 9 awards, international acclaim, and the show was canceled in September of 2016. That's the way the ball bounces. But anyways, it's great to be here. I've been a historian for almost, 20 years, I guess. I started in 1999. And this is one of my bread and butter lectures, the Hurricane of 1938. And as a historian, I belong to a number of historical societies, including the Historical Society of Watertown, the Waltham Historical Society, and the Marshfield Historical Society. And also, I've mentioned this before, the Society in Dedham for the Apprehension of Horse Thieves, parentheses, not. They've never caught a horse thief, but they have an annual banquet. I'm also an economic historian, former colonial reenactor with the Lincoln Minutemen, and I did a C- portrayal of Alexander Hamilton for a reenactors collaborative known as Solo Together. And I have over 100 lectures in my portfolio, and this one I've probably given close to 100 times. And it's great because I want to hear your stories. If you were around back then, every falling leaf, broken branch that you heard. I know that somebody's going to tell me that just as their mother called them to come inside, a branch broke where they would have been standing. Is that true? Right? See? There you go. I hear that every time. Well, look at what is a hurricane and take a snapshot of the Great Hurricane of 1938. A history of North Atlantic hurricanes. The two other major hurricanes that have struck New England since colonial times, the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635 and the Great September Gale of 1815. We'll look at the track and some factoids of the Great Hurricane of 38. We'll look at the summer leading up to the hurricane, a muffed forecast, record low air pressure, and then we'll track the storm as it hits New York City, Long Island, Connecticut, then Great New London Fire, Rhode Island, and finally Massachusetts. We've got some stories, some key stories. There's so many stories in the Great Hurricane of 1938. It's hard to select, but I've got a few called Wedding Splashers, the Mary Poppins of Brant Rock. And then you'll see the Connecticut River Valley getting battered, and then we'll look at the devastation. So, with the Great Hurricane of 1938, you're going to see acts of bravery and cowardice, acts of kindness and selfishness, providence, luck, and cruel fate. Up until that time, it was the most costly disaster in American history. Some people called it a lateral buzzsaw. Nobody was prepared because nobody was warned. There were some unlikely heroes, and by the time it died out on September 28, 1938, 10 states and 2 countries were affected. Not to go over hurricane ratings, but you've heard of Category 1 through 5. A tropical storm is with wind gusts between 40 and 73 miles per hour. A tropical depression, even less than that, 23 to 39 miles per hour. I think we've gone through, almost half a dozen of them this past year alone here in New England. A Cat 1 is maximum winds at 95 miles per hour. A Cat 3, maximum winds at 130 miles per hour. And Category 5, an inconceivable greater than 155 mile per hour winds sustained. Now, the last major hurricane to hit us here in New England was Hurricane Bob, but it was a tropical storm, if that. Does anybody remember that? August 1991. It devastated Cape Cod, Wareham area, Buzzards Bay. Now, if you look at the 3 facets of hurricane damage, the first is storm surge, okay? And that causes nearly 90% of all hurricane-related deaths. 200,000 people died in Bakurgunj, India in 1876 due to storm surge. 300,000 in Haiphong, China in 1881. Now, if you look at wind damage, hurricanes make landfall. Sometimes tornadoes form, but they knock, flying debris can cause damage. They knock over telephone poles, cause electrical wires to come down, destroy homes, tear off roofs, tear off awnings. They literally make lethal projectiles of objects that were permanently static, or so we thought when we constructed them. And finally, rainfall and flooding. As the hurricane diminishes, its impact is lasting with the flood. And with flood comes disease. If you look at the vulnerable American coast population here, especially in New England all the way down to Philadelphia, arguably down to the D.C. area, you'll see that the coastal population is surging there. A lot of the coastline all the way down through Florida and to the Gulf Coast is vulnerable to Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes. I like this particular graphic because it gives you an idea. A 100-year survey between 1886 and 1996, 110 years, shows where the hurricanes form off the west coast of Africa, and they move either in a west-northwest direction or northwest direction. And when you see them, the tracks, they either skirt the coast or they go out to sea. All right, let me just here do that. One thing, here we go. Okay. So, and then you didn't know that Newfoundland, right up here, is prone to hurricanes, did you? Up here in this area. Very much prone to hurricanes. And in fact, some of the hurricanes that ran up the Atlantic coast battered Ireland and England as well. You have some major hurricane years like this year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then you have some dormant years. But as we do an analysis, and geologists have done an analysis of sedimentary deposits that reveal that there were major hurricane strikes along the New England coast in approximately the year 1100 to 1150, 1300 to 1400, 1400 to 1450, and as I mentioned, 1635, the Great Colonial Hurricane, the Great September Gale of 1815, and then something that I'm trying to add is the fourth major hurricane called Saxby's Gale of 1869, post-Civil War. So Columbus was to come across the Atlantic, he didn't know, during hurricane season in September of 1492 and evade all sorts of major hurricanes and discover Hispaniola. He was very, very lucky because he came across the Atlantic at a very bad time of the year. First major hurricane to strike New England was the Great Colonial Hurricane that struck on August 16, 1835. We've talked about calendars before. That's the old style calendar, the Julian calendar. Governor John Winthrop said that it blew with such violence, with abundance of rain, that it blew down many hundreds of trees, overthrew some houses, and drove ships from their anchors. The tide rode at Narragansett 14 feet higher than ordinary and drowned 8 Indians flying from their wigwams. There's also a ship that was transporting some immigrants called the Angel Gabriel that was destroyed off of Cape Ann, and 21 lives were lost. We know that the Great Colonial Hurricane, the eye, passed to the south and east of Boston. And William Bradford of Plymouth, the leader of the Plymouth colony, said it caused the sea to swell to the south wind of this place above 20 foot, right up and down, and made many of the Indians to climb into trees for their safety. We know that he's talking about storm surge here in Plymouth. It continued about 5 or 6 hours, but the violence began to abate. It blew down many hundreds of thousands of trees. The signs and marks of it will remain this 100 years in these parts. So he's right about that. The trees would be knocked down. In fact, the hurricane in 1938, the remnants of all the trees that were destroyed would set the stage for major fires in New England in 1941, especially Massachusetts, April 21st to April 22nd, 1941. And then he equates astronomical phenomena with it. He says that the moon suffered a great eclipse the second night after it, and there's no correlation, except full moons bring in higher tides. The Great September Gale of 1815 struck on Saturday, September 23rd, 1815. Historian Noah Webster said the storm was a proper hurricane, and he was right. It was one of several storms that struck the North Atlantic shipping lanes that season. We know that it struck first Long Island near present-day Center Moriches. The Montauk Lighthouse was heavily damaged, and in the East River in New York, wharves were underwater by 3 feet at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we knew that the eye passed to the east of Hartford and the east of Springfield, Massachusetts. The Hampshire Gazette reported it was a tornado of wind and rain. In Yale, they had 6.5 inches of rain over 2 days. The New Haven Register said it drifted several hogshead of rum and molasses from the wharf. Very important when you lose alcohol back in those days, especially rum, molasses. Eastern Connecticut, all of Rhode Island, and east central Massachusetts were hit hard by this storm. People said the rain had a salty flavor. Houses and trees had a white hue from the ocean froth, and it whipped 90-foot sprays from the Charles River. In fact, I found an account of what could have been a water spout that formed on the Charles River in Cambridge today. If you look at the major hurricanes right here, of the 20th century. The yellow line is the unnamed hurricane of 1944. People forget about this one. It was 6 years after the hurricane of 38. It struck southern New England with ferocity. The hurricane of 38, we'll look at that track in a moment, that eventually died down over the Great Lakes. And then this one, Hurricane Donna, 1954. But looking at the hurricane...
I thought that was Hurricane Carol.
I'm sorry, Hurricane Carol. Hurricane Donna is 1960. You're right, Carol. Sorry. Thank you. I'll be on my best behavior moving forward in my accuracy. 2017, though, unprecedented this hurricane season, and the misery and destruction and the tens of billions of dollars that it's caused throughout the northern hemisphere, especially in North America and the Caribbean. Hurricane Harvey had a max rainfall of 60 inches in one town north of Port Arthur in Texas. And that would equate to, depending upon the temperature, 50 to 65 feet of snow. Think about that. Hurricane Irma, which hit Florida, had a max deposit of 16 inches of rain. Hurricane Maria, which struck the Caribbean, dumped 20 inches of rain in some parts of Puerto Rico. And just as a comparative note, in 2005, the maximum rainfall for Katrina was less than 8 inches. So just unprecedented amount of rain and the misery that spread. Now, the hurricane of 1938 was known as an extratropical cyclone. That is, as the eye wall diminishes, as the storm deteriorates, the duration of the storm is prolonged. It sits over an area and just dumps with a deluge of rain. Now, if we look at the track of this hurricane, you can see that on 8:30 a.m. here, September 18th, it's located due about east of Cuba. By September 19th, the following morning, it's east of the Bahamas. By the 20th of September, it's off the coast of Florida, central Florida, and then it races north. It's off Cape Hatteras by the 21st by 8:30 a.m. and then strikes in the early mid-afternoon in New York City. So you can just see where it developed on roughly around September 10th through the 23rd, and it struck New England and New York late on the afternoon, 21st. It began as a hurricane Category 1 on September 13th, 74 miles per hour. By September 17th, it was a Category 3. And by September 19th, Category 5 with sustained winds of 160 miles per hour. And they have, over the years, some historians have revised the actual path of it. But for all intent and purpose, it went up just due west of the Connecticut River Valley. I argue that it went right up the Connecticut River Valley. But we know that this was the most costly U.S. disaster in that year. It moved rapidly up the coast at 67 miles per hour. That traveled 700 miles in 12 hours. That is moving. Landfall winds at 127 miles per hour, sustained at 121 miles per hour when it hit here. Top winds were measured at 156 miles per hour, but we think the Blue Hills in Canton, just down the road from here, had a wind gust at 186 miles per hour. There are 40 to 50-foot storm surges in some places. It hit at high tide, which exacerbated the effect. Seas rose 17 feet in places. Salt water sprayed houses in Montpelier, Vermont, 120 miles away from the ocean. Southern New England coastal areas were inundated. Most victims drowned. Some actually had their clothes blown off. There are two fishermen that their ship, they got caught out. And remember, they weren't warned, and they got their clothes blown off them. So they knocked on this woman's door, and she was terrified, this elderly woman. It's just, all I have is women's clothes. And they put on women's clothes, and they hitched a ride. The police officer pulled up with his eyes wide open, gave them a ride into town. The first impact of the storm surge was registered on seismographs in Alaska. And seawater actually destroyed vegetation 20 miles inland in some places. Every community here had a story to tell. They're numerous, and we'll touch on those. If you look at the summer of 1938, there was record precipitation in June and July. Let me back up a bit. There was a great flood of 1936, which flooded the Connecticut River Valley. So it had loosened up the soil in some places, loosened up some of the levees. So it's only 2 years removed from one of the greatest floods that New England's ever seen. But it rained throughout, record precipitation in June and July, and then it was a muggy August and a really muggy September. The rivers began to rise, and there was a constant rain from September 17th through September 20th. The heaviest rain fell the day before the hurricane on September 20th. In the Thames River Basin in Connecticut, 13 inches fell in 5 days. Some areas reported 17 inches in 5 days. So you have soft soil, weak foundations, and the roots for trees are loosened. So the hurricane's impact is amplified. If you picked up the paper on Wednesday, September 21st, 1938, you'll see the Treaty of Munich was imminent. Chamberlain, I won't go off on him, had handed over the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, to Hitler through annexation, despite the protests by Winston Churchill. The Red Sox beat the St. Louis Browns 8-4, but they were 11 games back in the American League. And then Lowell Sun's forecast said, the Lowell Sun said, the weatherman says more rain and cooler tonight and Thursday. New York Times, ironically, cruel irony, had an editorial the day of the hurricane. Every year, an average of 3 such whirlwinds sweep the tropical North Atlantic between June and November. In 1933, there was an all-time record of 20. If New York and the rest of the world have been so well informed about the cyclone, it is because of an admirably organized meteorological service. In Washington Weather Bureau, I mean, the times we live in, literally, you can plan your walk with the radar up until 3 minutes before the rain comes. There are apps on the cell phones that people are addicted to. That's why people, their eyes eventually over time will shift up to the top of their head so they can see ahead while they're skiing. But you can, apps that track lightning. So at Washington Weather Bureau, they didn't have radar. There were no satellites. All they had is measurements. They did have telephone, and they could phone in air pressure measurements and visual observations. So they knew if a storm was tracking from west to east, if a storm was tracking from south to north. So a 28-year-old by the name of Charles Pierce is filling in at the Washington Weather Bureau for two vacationing meteorologists, and he argues that he's looking at the storm and the measurements, the barometric pressure, and he thinks that the storm will be sandwiched between two high-pressure systems, and it would be pinballed directly north towards New England. Longtime veteran Charles Mitchell ignores his forecast. Son, no hurricane has hit New Jersey during my tenure, and the current storm, my friend, is weakening. Wrong. Now the barometer starts to play tricks. On the RMS Corinthia, they had a reading of 27.85, which is the lowest in recorded history in the North Atlantic. This was off the coast of Virginia early in the morning of September 21st. Fire Island, within 2 hours, went from a low reading of 29.78 to an inconceivable low of 27.43 on the 21st. And on September 21st, a man in West Hampton Beach thought that his new barometer was broken when it measured 28. He brought it back to the post office, and while he was packaging it up, the hurricane struck and destroyed his house. On the Red Star liner Königstein, skipper Alfred Leidig had a barometer reading of 28.40 with 100-mile-per-hour winds. On September 19th, Reverend Ernest Gierzi, who was an Italian Jesuit with 23 years of meteorological experience, was on board the Italian liner Conte di Savoia, and he was bound for New York, and he said, and I hate to sound like Count Chocula, but one of my children will be around in about 3 days, after checking his weather charts and the barometric readings and the sky conditions, and he was right. New York City, the average gale began, and it was only about 65 miles per hour, which falls in the parameters of a tropical storm, but they would get hit with 4.5 inches of rain. The city was gridlocked from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., and thousands were marooned in office buildings. There was extensive flooding of streets and basements, and at 8:45 p.m. there was a power failure at Consolidated Edison that left all of the Bronx and parts of Manhattan in darkness. The only death was a hitchhiker who decided that he'd abandoned the stalled car that he was riding in, and he got pulled out by the current and the storm surge. Fort Schuyler Road and Throgs Neck had 9 feet waters by 7:30 p.m. The storm's first hero was a man by the name of J. Gilbert Finning, age 40, and his friend Billy McGrath, age 30. During evacuation of Fort Schuyler Road, Finning slipped and fell while he was pushing an elderly woman in the boat. McGrath went after him, and both perished. McGrath was posthumously awarded the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission's Bronze Medal for his act of bravery. Now, this storm was called the Long Island Express. And if you can see the exposure here of Long Island in New York from Montauk all the way into Kennedy Airport, you can see how they're exposed to the Atlantic. And if a hurricane hits head on, you'll see some of these communities were absolutely devastated. Long Island was hammered. Long Island Expressway. Now, some wealthy homeowners, these were the days of servants, where people could afford servants, where there was basically an upper class and a lower class and not much of a middle class. Some wealthy homeowners forced their servants to remain in their mansions and cottages while they packed up the wagon and evacuated, sealing their fate. One account had a family and friends packed into a car that drove off with their servants, watching an ankle-deep rising water on their driveway. Some pets and horses were left behind to fend for themselves and subsequently were lost. After a tree fell on his car, a man on Long Island frantically ran up to a police officer and shook him, saying, "That car's brand new. Who can I sue? Who can I sue?" So there's the selfishness motive. And then there was substantial looting for the first time in the United States. This is East Hampton. Some of these old trees that fell across the roadways. This is the Southern Long Island East Hampton Library. West Hampton, Long Island, 28 dead, 4 missing. 153 of 179 houses were destroyed. This is the Long Island Expressway, where trees fell like 10 pins along the highway. Bridgehampton, New York. Looks like an earthquake struck, and you'll see some photographs. And of the estimated 2 billion trees that were lost in the Northeast to this hurricane, 3,500 trees were lost in the Bridgehampton, Sagaponack, Hayground area alone. Now, these elm and locust trees formed a half-mile-long arch, beautiful during the fall, I was told, over Main Street, and they had been planted there before the American Revolution, and they can still be seen in the canvases of many important artists of the period. But when the storm was over, 42% of all the Main Street elms were gone. Look at Nassau. Looks like piles of seaweed. That's a neighborhood. And again, these were the times where lax building codes. People could build right up to where the tide would lap on your front porch. Dune Deck, Bayside, New York. The ocean tore an inlet between West Hampton Beach and Quogue, 400 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Waves broke on lawns 1 mile inland. Fire Island, New York, 6 miles south of Bay Shore across Great South Bay. Salt Air lost 125 houses. Kismet and Fair Harbor, 91 homes. Oak Beach, 29 homes. Ocean Beach and Point of Woods also suffered some severe damage. This is a sandbar, but believe it or not, there were over 200 homes perched on dunes 20 feet high here on Fire Island, Long Island. Frederick Foster Duran was 54 years old, the vice president of the Fulton Trust Company. His New York train had been marooned in Warwick, Rhode Island. Usually his 15-minute trip home took 2 hours, and he was one of the lucky ones. But he got home by 8 o'clock, and as he washed up for dinner, he dropped dead from exhaustion and exposure. At Salt Air, the morning after a storm, a young blonde girl sat on a box. As Chief Assistant District Attorney Lindsay Henry arrived, she asked, "Could you assist us in the search for a body?" "Of course, young lady," he said. "Whose body is it?" She shut her eyes tightly and sadly said, "My mother's." There were heroes. West Hampton Police Chief Stanley Teller and Police Officer Timothy Robinson saved 17 lives. Halfway across the West Bay Bridge, they abandoned their 2 cruisers and waded and swam the rest of the way. They saved a helpless woman and her 3 children in deep water on Dune Road. They led all 17 people they could round up onto the roof of a house. A huge wave swept the house off of its foundation, and 3 hours later, they landed at Quogue, having crossed the bay, and no lives were lost. Now, these are one of the few stories that I chose on Long Island. It's the flight of the BURGHARDS, I call it. George and Mabel Burghard, along with their fox terrier Bitsy and their cocker spaniel Peter, with caretakers Carl and Selma Dalen, rented a cottage. They were 75 feet from the top of a 9-foot sand dune, 100 feet from Dune Road, and 75 feet from the Coast Guard station. They were 200 feet away from the water's edge at high tide. The neighbors between houses, there was a little inlet, had a 30-foot cabin cruiser moored to the dock. By 10 a.m., the wind was strong from the north. The skies were overcast. It began to drizzle, and the seas got heavy. An hour later, at 11 a.m., the wind shifts to the east, and then to the northeast, and it's blowing at gale force. The servant, Mr. Dalen, reports that water's bubbling through the concrete floor of the garage. They thought it was fresh water from the Bayside. They tasted it. It was salt water. Erosion. Mabel went upstairs and put on her swimsuit. Noontime. The neighbor's boat next door is drifting, so Burghard calls Chief Boatswain's mate James Ketchum at Mauritius Coast Guard Station, 3 miles to the west of their location. And like any brave Coast Guard man, he says, "I'll be right down." At 1 p.m. on radio station AM WESF, we interrupt this radio broadcast to bring you a special report. The West Indies hurricane is in the mid-Atlantic. Wrong. It was right on top of them. Electric power at this point is still on. By 1:30 p.m., Mr. Burghard's friend Bill Ottman calls and says, "My garage just got blown into the bay." At 2 o'clock, 90-mile-per-hour winds were shifting to the east and water was now 2 feet deep in Burghard's garage. Mabel was now sewing in the sunroom with her back to the bay windows. Mrs. Dalen, the servant, politely said, "You might want to change your seat." And just as she changes her seat, the window blows out with glass shards blown everywhere. By 2:30 p.m., the wind and the rain intensifies, and their bathhouse, those are the days of outhouses, is swept away. By 3 o'clock, Burghard tells Mr. Dalen, "Pack all the clothes and let's move to the 3rd floor." 10 minutes later, at 3:10 p.m., a wave broke through the back door and swept Mr. Dalen off of his feet. By 3:30 p.m., John Avery, the Coast Guard man, came across the meadow and said, "Let's get moving quick, people. No time to lose. Let's go." High tide was due at 6:10 p.m. So Mr. Burghard stuffs his tennis tickets for the match at Forest Hills the next day into his pocket, as if there was going to be a tennis match. By 4 o'clock, Mabel Burghard picks up their dogs, Peter, and George Burghard picks up the dog, Bitsy. The Dalens, who are much older now, seem to be dilly-dallying. The wind gusts are now over 100 miles per hour, and they have to make a half-mile walk with Avery to the bridge across the bay. Mrs. Dalen was being nearly dragged by the Coast Guardsman, Mr. Avery. Meanwhile, as they made their way down the road, old Carl was clinging to a fence post back on the driveway as the group moved down the road. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to walk headlong into 100-mile-per-hour winds. I haven't. I've walked into 70-mile-per-hour winds, and it knocks you right down. It takes a very strong person. So he's clinging literally for his life to the fence post on the driveway. He was exhausted, so Carl Dalen sat down on the fence post, and he was now 75 feet behind the group. But he can't hear their call due to the wind. It's just blowing the sound just over his head. And Mrs. Dalen now, and you can imagine how she would be feeling, is hysterical for her husband. The wind suddenly shifts to the southeast at 110 miles per hour. And then, according to witnesses, 50-foot breakers roar over the sand dunes. Flotsam drifts by in raging sea torrents. There's a boat tied to the dock, and the group moves towards it. By 4:15 p.m., with a sickening crash, the Coast Guard station itself hits the bay and smashes to pieces. And just then, the line snaps, and the boat, their only salvation that they were heading towards, is dragged out to sea. Electric wires hit the ocean in puddles, and electrocution is a distinct possibility. Mrs. Dalen is now 50 feet behind the group, refusing to move, calling to her husband, who is 125 feet behind. The Burghards, each with a dog under their arms, go out on a broken dock and lie down. They hope to ride it like a surfboard. And just then, a large flat piece of wooden siding comes by, and Mabel, George, and the 2 dogs and Coast Guardsman Avery climb on it, leaving the Dalens behind. The wind had driven the bay water across to the mainland with such force that for about 200 feet, the bay bottom was dry. Now, as you're probably looking at the hurricane reports, especially when it was coming up to Tampa, the river in Tampa receded, and the beaches receded. It almost looked like it was the precursor to a tsunami where the waters pulled out. The Dalens are helpless. The Burghards and Avery jump off the board and wait for a giant wave that takes them 200 feet out into the bay. 6-foot waves continually wash them off the board, and they climb right back on. They dodge flotsam, cars, jagged glass, and boards with nails moving quickly by them. They place the dogs on a trailer raft behind them. Bitsy is washed off, and little Peter grabs him by the ear and drags him back onto the raft. They paddle around huge chunks of houses and debris. They report that ducks fly backwards at 40 miles per hour. Finally, the raft is grounded in berry bushes. Bitsy the dog disappears in the brush, and they land 1 mile west from their home at Onek, across the bay, and they head to higher ground at the golf course. They wave down a car and make their way into West Hampton. Coast Guardsman Avery, he's not done. He moves off to help more people. Some of their personal belongings were found miles away from their home, and the Dalen's bodies, when they were located, they found Carl near the golf course, ironically, just a few hundred yards from where they landed with a broken leg. But John Avery is cited for bravery by the Coast Guard. They find wood is pierced through wood like an arrow. Every street corner now has an armed man looking for looters. And there was 48-hour, 2-day price gouging of the stores that managed to somehow stay open. And that awful sea smell stuck around for over a year on Long Island. Gymnasium at Quogue turned into a mortuary. Before, after. A breach at Shinnecock Inlet. You can see where the force of the water broke through the inlet. And 1 month after it was opened, the hurricane, that afternoon, Shinnecock Inlet was born, changing the currents, changing the actual fishing grounds there. The heroes of Stony Point, one of my favorite stories. 60 colonies that had come imported from the Adirondacks of 500 beavers built 60 dams during the storm. The dams in Palisades Park held back swollen rivers and ponds. The beavers worked all through the night of the hurricane to fortify their bulwarks. Long Mountain Beaver Pond doubled in size from 5 to 10 acres due to the dam made of mud, sticks, stones, and sod. It was 150 yards long and 6 feet high, held fast, only spilling 18 inches of water over its top. Cedar Hill Pond Dam doubled in size to 8 acres. It was 40 feet wide and the water rose 2 feet. But these buck-toothed heroes saved 5 arterial highways used for evacuation. They saved many lives. Long Mountain Road, Johnstown Road, U.S. Highways 617, and Route 9 West. The heroes of Stony Point. Now, the ships that were caught at sea, the normal ferries, for instance. One was known as the Park City, a ferry that left Port Jefferson, New York at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for a normal 2-hour run to Bridgeport in Connecticut. Captain Ray Dickerson tried to turn back, but the wind shifted and forced him to drop anchor. Rogue waves filled the hold with over 5 feet of water, and at 3:15, fires under the boilers went out, stopping the steam engine and stopping their progress cold. They were at the mercy of the drift. The anchor finally caught something by 7:30 p.m. as the crew bailed out the engine room. Most passengers, and I don't know if you've ever taken the Nantucket ferry or Martha's Vineyard ferry or any ferry during any sort of rough water, especially the smaller ones, but the passengers had to sleep in their cars, stay in their cars. The ship was finally spotted the following morning at 7 a.m. by a Coast Guard cutter and towed to safety. It took 21 hours, and also another ship known as the Ruth R. was blown from Montauk to Block Island, spent 18 hours adrift. Now, the southeast coast was slammed from Saybrook Saybrook Point to Stonington in Connecticut. Again, the Connecticut coastline is still exposed to the Atlantic. The Bostonian was a passenger train that had 275 passengers. Many were businessmen, and others were students returning from or going to prep schools. Well, they had just served lunch, and at 3:30 p.m., the railroads were ordered to halt. The train fireman got out of the train and he walked in waist-deep water down to one of the flagmen, the signalman, who was up in a tower. Water was rising rapidly, and they told people to stay put. Some chose to get out of the train and were never seen again. Suddenly, a 30-foot sailboat smashed into the train, in the front of the train. So what they did is the back of the train rather, they took 160 people and they wanted to move them forward into the locomotive and the 2 trailer cars. Now, some of the people were hesitating to moving. I just got served lunch, I'm going to finish that. So the conductor, by the name of Brown, I believe his name was, smashed the fire axe and held it over his head. Now who's moving up front? And they all moved up to the front of the train. So the engineer tried to turn the engine over. First try, wouldn't go. Second try, would not turn over. Third try, wouldn't start. So they decide that they have to uncouple some of the cars. So one of the engineers actually goes underwater, holding his breath, uncoupling during a hurricane the trains that were derailed. And on the 4th try, after they uncoupled the derailed cars, the engine turned over, And then when they finally rolled into Stonington Station, they had saved 160 lives. Famous picture of Hurricane 38, a steepleson, a 120-year-old steeple in Danielson, Connecticut. One other story, I don't think I mentioned it here, is in Long Island, a chicken farmer the day before had just banded his chickens. Right? The inspector came, poultry inspector, put these little med thing. After the hurricane, and this is in Long Island, they found one of his chickens in Connecticut. Katharine Hepburn. She's in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. She's considered, at this point in her career, in late September 1938, to be box office poison. She had just auditioned for a new film that was about to commence production. With her boyfriend, Red Hammond, she went and played golf, and it was very humid and breezy that day. On the par 3 ninth hole, she scored a hole-in-one. She finished with her best round ever, an incredible 31 on 9 holes. Afterwards, she and Red went for a swim in front of the house. She stated about the breezy weather and the rising surf and the conditions. She said, "Something very special is going to happen." The family had an elegant summer house there since the turn of the century. Her brother Dick was working on a movie script at that time, and Kate was waiting to hear if she had gotten the part, ironically, of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. She had just finished making Bringing Up Baby, which was a bomb at the box office earlier that year. The water rose 17 feet high. Dick and Catherine got the family out as 2 chimneys crumbled and their guest cottage drifted a half-mile away. Family heirlooms were lost in the mud. Days later, when Kate got home, she was on her knees, inebriated, some say, digging in vain for her family's jewelry as Red tugged gently on her shoulders and whispered, "Kate, it's time to leave." Her brother Dick found his typewriter and the scripts perfectly intact, and he never sold those scripts. Nobody wanted them. The battle for COLT'S DIKE, of COLT'S DIKE. During the 1930s, we're coming out of what economical crisis? The Depression, right? The president during the 1930s is FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He created the WPA to create jobs for unemployed workers. Well, 1,200 WPA workers, most of them World War I vets or college students and volunteers, fought to keep 1 million tons out of the south end of the city of Hartford that was devastated in 1936 by the great 1936 flood. Army engineers said there was a 50-50 chance that the dike would hold when the water crested what they estimated to be 28 feet. There was a plan to dynamite Clark's Dike should it not hold to save the industrial area. So they're deciding, do you save the industrial area and jobs, or do you save the residential area? Now, this is the Connecticut River in Hartford. There's the arrow points to the Travelers Insurance Tower. In the old State House, the clock stopped at 4:10 p.m. that day on September 21st, 1938. Mrs. Carl Carlson is driving towards Guilford, Connecticut, and she stopped in traffic as they were removing a tree from the road. She picks up a book to read. Just then a tree came crashing down on her car, killing her instantly. And of course, she was reading Gone with the Wind. Now, the Connecticut River rose 4 inches per hour. Matt Strong caught a 5-pound bass with his bare hands on Main Street. Frank Fredsol's apple tree was blown over, and then later in the storm blown upright, and it yielded fruit for a few years later. Now in New London, storm surge, 110-mile-per-hour winds, and a great fire. Now, they were east of the eye, and you can see some of the impact of some of the photographs here of any of the marine vessels that were just crammed into the shore, blown by the wind. But New London was no stranger to bad fires. When Benedict Arnold turned, he burned to the ground in 1781, 1 month before the British surrendered at Yorktown. But the glow of the 1938 fire, which was set off by the hurricane, could be seen in the cloudy skies from the Long Island and Rhode Island coastlines. That's how big this thing was. It burned dozens of buildings before it burned itself out in the dampness. But the wind served as an accelerant. The 5-masted Marcella blew out of the water on Sparyard Street, crossed the railroad tracks, and struck the corner of Humphrey Cornell Building, somehow starting an electrical fire in the flooded basement. I did an interview with historian Sally Ryan. It's about 45 minutes. You can find it online about this great fire. Tremendous story. It was reported at 4:30 p.m. All communication went down 20 minutes later. The fire department went on ham radio and asked for any volunteers if they could help. They were stretched thinly across the city. Embers were being blown into Star, Green, and Pearl Street warehouses, so the entire lower harbor of New London was ablaze at this time. The conflagration was left to feed upon itself. Downed trees impaired firefighters' mobility, and of course, if they were in the wrong direction, the hose spray blew back into their faces. Finally, the wind shifted, and the fire actually burned itself out. It turned on itself. But 13 commercial buildings burned to the ground. 89 buildings were damaged or destroyed during the Great New London Fire. And this is what New London looked like after the fire on the coastline. And I don't know if you've been down to the coast. It's a beautiful area down there. In Cheshire, Connecticut, Patrick Joyce was killed when he was hurled against the brick wall of a prison building. He was on the outside. And then it hit Rhode Island. And you can see the Rhode Island coast is exposed to the North Atlantic. The Moore family, just like we've heard before, 11 people, including 3 of their servants, were crammed into the sturdy house on the edge of Little Narragansett Bay. Mr. Moore had suffered a heart attack that morning, but somehow managed to board up his house. The roof was ripped off and thrown into the sea, and the entire family jumped onto this ad hoc raft. Huge waves crashed upon them. In fact, hammerhead sharks reportedly followed them. Now, that's kind of preposterous, but if you could think of when I told you about the storm moving from the tropics at 67 miles per hour, 700 miles in 12 hours, conceivably it could take that marine life with it. They floated clear across the Peninsula Bay and drifted into the cove on Barn Island. And on Barn Island, hence the name, they huddled in an abandoned barn and they watched the glow of the New London fire until they were rescued by a lobsterman the following day. Now, Watch Hill Beach. All 39 houses on Watch Hill Beach were wiped off the face of the earth. It's now a sand dune. People take boat rides. They can't believe that houses were perched upon them. A 20-mile stretch from Napatree Point to Point Judith, 175 were killed. So you can see Napatree Point before, Watch Hill, Rhode Island. Again, look, the waves lapping right up to the bottom deck of this club here, and then the next day, gone. 17 people were swept away, never to be seen again. It hit westerly Rhode Island at 3:50 p.m. and killed 100. In Misquamicut Beach in Rhode Island, 194 of 200 homes were destroyed. They found 50 bodies in the sand dunes. Misquamicut Beach along the Rhode Island coast, it looks like sawdust. Island Park, Rhode Island. Only 2 houses remained of the 200 that were there. 19 killed. And you can see it looks like almost an earthquake hit. Newport, Rhode Island, the Tidal Marsh. A storm surge of epic proportions funneled up on Connecticut Island in the middle of Narragansett Bay, and a full grade school bus was swept off a narrow causeway into the raging storm surge, which killed 7 of the 10 children. Connecticut Beach, Narragansett Bay, 100 homes destroyed. Oakland Beach, 100 homeless. A woman said, "My baby has just been blown out of my arms." 15 people perished in Barrington, Rhode Island, and Jamestown. Look at the erosion here caused. It looks like an earthquake hit. This is Governor Carr Ferry in Jamestown, Rhode Island. 86 of 100 boats were destroyed on Block Island. And the 3 things you heard most, and I know this going through a fire at my house 5 years ago, almost to the day. 3 things my wife and I said, where do we go now? Everything we own is gone. And of course, we had no insurance, or we were underinsured. The rats at Brown University, and this is not a reference to the people who work there at the bursar's office. The calls came in at about to a couple of local exterminators that mice had infested a women's dormitory and that rats were seen early in the morning in the library at Brown University. Were they seeking higher ground at College Hill? Many cats and dogs went missing on the morning of the hurricane, and squirrels and birds were reportedly moving about in an agitated manner, according to a Plymouth resident who attended my lecture and told me that. Animals know. Providence, Rhode Island. The city became a perfect funnel and aqueduct. Storm surge struck at 5:15, just as work was letting out. And power went out, people were leaving their offices, a white wall of water rushed up Providence River, and a deluge of water 13 feet high hit the city streets. Providence River, 17 feet it rose in 70 minutes. Appliances and consumer goods floated down the streets from department stores. Again, we're just turning the corner with the Depression. Canoe, this downtown Providence at Exchange Place. Here's the steamer Monhegan, wedged in downtown Providence. Wedding splashers. Joe Fogel and Lorraine Martin were scheduled to get married on the second floor in the ballroom of the Narragansett Hotel in downtown Providence on September 21st, 1938. Where's Joe? Cold feet? No. He's stuck at Union Station along with his family. So 500 refugees of the storm sought shelter from the storm in the hotel. And they came upon a wedding banquet and ate all the food and drank all the champagne. Joe finally showed up at 11 p.m. They were married by candlelight by an anxious minister. They took a short walk on muddy streets, and the water receded, by the way, in Providence by 10 o'clock that night, and they went to their honeymoon suite at the Biltmore Hotel. The Mary Poppins of Brant Rock. A 10-year-old boy in Brant Rock, Mass. saw that the weather was getting wild late on the afternoon of September 21st, 1938. He decided to heighten the exhilaration of the storm by getting his grandfather's best umbrella out of the closet and climbed up onto the garage roof. He jumped off the roof thinking that he might fly. As he tumbled to the ground, the umbrella was bent and broken. He received red bottom for his poor judgment. And that boy was my father. I talked about the Great Flood of 36, where the Springfield Police for a time were the Springfield Coast Guard, but again, that devastating flood 2 years earlier. Now, Massachusetts South Coast. There was actually an eyewitness to the storm surge that hit Horseneck Beach in Buzzards Bay at about 5 o'clock, and he said a long black band was approaching. A solid black wall of water looked like an unusually large black roller coming into the shore with its top being blown off, so it did not curl up and break like an ordinary wave. He's actually seeing the storm surge. There are 30-foot waves at Horseneck Beach. 41 perished in Fall River. Ships, boats, and barges were torn off their moorings and docks. The oil tanker Phoenix spilled its cargo and was blown across the river onto lawns. In New Bedford, 9 cotton mills were destroyed. 10,000 employees were jobless, and New Bedford economy would never, ever recover again from the storm of 1938. The Acushnet River rose 11 feet, and 1,500 people were left homeless in Fairhaven. A quote from the New Bedford Standard Times said, "Women stood with babies in their arms and watched the horizon in the ageless manner of wives whose men ply the sea. Others went from boat to boat asking the same question. Everywhere, the answer was a simple negative shake of the head." Have you seen them? Images of Westport Harbor, south coast of Massachusetts. New Bedford. Woods Hole. Wareham. Bourne Bridge. Bourne Bridge had just opened a few years earlier, and some National Guardsmen mourned the tragedy under the Bourne Bridge. A family lost their home, thrown right into the Cape Cod Canal. 25-foot waves at Chilmark, Martha's Vineyard, Menemsha. And the bridge from Gayhead there to Menemsha was destroyed. This is Shawmut Beach in Rhode Island. East Brookfield, New Bedford, Springfield, East Bridgewater, Mattapoisett, Taunton. Everybody felt the wrath of the great hurricane of 1938. Newton, Fairhaven, Wareham, West Brookfield, Mattapoisett, Boston. Everybody felt the impact. Worcester, North Uxbridge, Putnam, Connecticut. Downtown Boston, Arlington Street, trees uprooted. Again, some of the beautiful trees that decorated Arlington Street and some of the old colonial streets of Boston gone in the storm. The Massachusetts State House. The Hat Shell and the Esplanade. Various coastal communities devastated. This is the aqueduct in downtown Providence at the height of the storm. Trolley cars stranded. What used to be a thriving immigrant community here, devastated. New Bedford. Getting more houses. This is Saltaire. You know, in downtown Providence, New Bedford, boats hurled ashore. Lexington Green, where it all began, American Revolution, Battle of Lexington and Concord. In fact, that tree there was actually there during the conflict, which took place in April 19, 1775. Exeter, New Hampshire. Even Peterborough, New Hampshire. Papers came out, 45 killed in wild hurricane. Property damage in the millions, hundreds hurt by wreckage, Boston Post. Then came the Globe, hurricane dead, 250. Then came the Daily News, 322 dead in storm, 37 in New York. Deaths now 390 according to the Daily Record. Boston Herald, storm deaths mount to 515, 100,000 homeless. We know that the peak steady winds were measured at 121 miles per hour. 80% of New England homes lost power that day. As I mentioned earlier in the open, the peak gust was measured at 186 miles per hour at Blue Hill Observatory. The lowest pressure on land was at Belport, New York, 27.94 or 946.2 millibars. Peak storm surge 17 feet above normal high tide in Rhode Island. Peak wave heights 50 feet, it was claimed in Gloucester. 700 deaths, 600 in New England. 63,000 homeless. 20,000 miles of power wire knocked down. 8,900 homes and buildings were destroyed. 3,300 boats were lost. 26,000 automobiles were lost. Trees destroyed, $2 billion. Cost, $6.2 million, 1938 dollars. $15 billion, 1998 adjusted. 2018 adjusted, approximately $24.2 billion. Shirley Ann Gatz, and I always ask this, is there anybody here born on September 20th or September 21st, 1938? The reason why I ask, Shirley Ann Gatz was born at 3:28 p.m. at Eastern Long Island Hospital just as the roof blew off and flooded the delivery room. So the reason is because of incredibly low air pressure that induces births. So nobody. I have had a couple of people raise their hands. How about a video before we close off here? Then we'll talk about questions here. And this is just Ed Hurley. I'm going to show you some of the actual footage of the hurricane.
September 1938, the eastern seaboard is...
Volume 54.
Thank you.
Volume 66.
I see that.
New York was a city of deluge, as 70-mile-an-hour winds whipped torrential rain for hour after hour. It turned streets into rivers and slowed the pulse of the city. The hurricane center cut north across Long Island. The damage to suburban areas was staggering. Drains and sewer systems were useless, and the raging seas poured millions of tons of water far inland. Fire compounded the disastrous ravages of the hurricane. In New London, Connecticut, for example, the waterfront was gutted. Blocked roads isolated the community. No help could reach the beleaguered firemen. As the storm spiraled out to sea, there was a sad inventory to take in the eastern states. From Atlantic City to Twin Mountain, New Hampshire, the hurricane had left a trail of devastation. $300 million was a conservative estimate of the damage. 600 people were dead, and the task of rebuilding taxed the resources of town and hamlet.
So, and then here's another one here. Again, they weren't warned. What's the weather going to be like today? You look outside the window. The sun is out, not a cloud in the sky. But you heard the weather report, and you know it's going to rain. So you grab an umbrella and head out for your day. But back in 1938, when New England's last great hurricane struck, nobody was prepared because nobody was warned. It's mid-September, 1938. At the U.S. Weather Bureau, young Charlie Pierce is filling in for two vacationing meteorologists. He's mulling over the weather data he received on the monster hurricane that's sitting off the coast of the Bahamas. It's situated between two high-pressure systems. But something's just not right. This hurricane isn't going to blow out to the sea. It's going to head north and strike the vulnerable New England coastline. This could be bad. He calls over veteran meteorologist Charles Mitchell, who ignores his warnings. The current storm is weakening and will be blown out to sea. But the monster hurricane was moving north at an incredible 67 miles per hour, covering an unheard of 700 miles in just 12 hours. This was a monster. In West Hampton, New York, a man walks into a post office with his new barometer. He wants to return it. It's broken. He can't be reading this. In Old Saybrook, Connecticut, actress Katharine Hepburn has just auditioned for a major film role. She's out celebrating with a round of golf. On the 9th hole, she scores a hole-in-one. She turns to her boyfriend, Red Hammond, and says, "I think something very special is going to happen today." In Long Mountain Pond, something strange is going on. Beavers are working furiously, dragging sticks, sod, mud, anything they can get their little mitts on. They're building dams. The people look on curiously. In New Bedford, Massachusetts, a wily old fisherman is returning to the harbor, but he just went out a few hours ago. "I ain't going out there. I feel it in my bones. A big storm is coming." At 3:30 p.m., a radio station in New York broadcast,
The West Indies hurricane is in the mid-Atlantic and will move out to sea.
people thought they were safe. But in reality, the storm was right on top of them. By late in the afternoon, the beautiful September day was over. The hurricane had arrived. They called it the Long Island Express, and it slammed into the New York coastline with a 30-foot storm surge. It dislodged boats, and people's homes were flooded. The winds were so strong. Roofs were being blown off of houses. Geese were flying backwards at 40 miles per hour. People were having their clothes blown right off them. The hurricane raced across Long Island Sound and crashed into Connecticut. The river in Hartford rose 4 inches every hour. In New London, not only did they have to contend with the wind and the flooding, but there was a major inferno that had engulfed the city, and no one could put it out. New Bedford, Massachusetts got walloped. Fishing fleets were destroyed as boats were hurled miles inland. This was a gigantic storm. The waves pounding the shoreline were measured on seismographs in Sitka, Alaska. Sea spray was hitting the homes of Montpelier, Vermont, 125 miles away from the ocean. And on top of the Great Blue Hill in Milton, Massachusetts, a gust was measured at over 185 miles per hour. And just as quickly and violently it had struck, suddenly, it was over. It was time to assess the damage. Over 2 billion trees had fallen, 35,000 automobiles destroyed, 9,000 boats lost, and 700 people gave their lives to the Great Hurricane of 1938. Charlie Pierce may have predicted that the hurricane would strike the Northeast, but no one could have foreseen the massive destruction. The dams the beavers built at various ponds saved roads and highways that were used for evacuation. Coastal communities like New Bedford took years to recover and develop protective measures like seawalls, breakers, and limiting construction on the shoreline. Over time, advances in forecasting technology have helped us predict weather with greater accuracy, saving countless lives. But as the old saying goes, if you don't like the weather in New England, just wait a few minutes. So that was our take on the folklore, but just looking at some second half of the 20th century great hurricanes. As I mentioned, the Great Atlantic Hurricane 1944. And as you can see, the track goes basically to the west of the Cape Cod Canal, and the eye actually passes over Boston. Edna in 1954 skirted the outer edge of Cape Cod. Carroll of 54 went right up the river valley, just as the other hurricanes of 1815, 1938, and the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635, right up the Connecticut River Valley. Diane of 55 went inland and then went out to sea, but managed to brush the northeast coast in one of these early satellite images. Donna of 1960, again, went just to the east of the Connecticut River Valley and just to the west in terms of the eye of Boston. Now, here we are in 2017 going into 2018 in the hurricane season. It'll be the 80th anniversary, 80 years since a major hurricane struck New England. And for Boston, as you know, we're a low-lying area. Originally, Boston was just the Shawmut Peninsula, right, which almost looked like an isthmus or a promontory, like a lollipop. And the back bay was filled in with debris when they leveled some of the three major hills, the three mountains, Tri-Mountain, and also the Great Fire of 1872, November 9th. Again, talking about another anniversary, 1872. We're just a few years away from this. It's going to be, 145 years in 2 days, November 9th. Anyways, you can see that it was filled in and built upon. So if a hurricane struck, the biggest fear is if it somehow jogs to the west, if it's passing to the east of us and jogs to the west, and somehow churns up the water in Cape Cod Bay and throws it with the water coming from the northeast direction, Boston would get hammered. And we have endured, as hardy New Englanders, many, many nor'easters. I mean, one thing that we can shoulder off and just brush off is a nor'easter. But a hurricane, especially if it came up and it scoured Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, they would not survive. Be very, very lucky in the scramble to get off the island. Block Island, again, would be devastated. But my thoughts are that we are overdue and that it'll be our turn. You know, and unfortunately, I don't know when. Could be next year, could be 5 years, could be 80 more years. But at some point, New England, you'll get yours in terms of a hurricane. So I want to thank you for coming out here today. My sources, some great books out there. A Wind to Shake the World, Everett Allen, great book. Michael Grammatico with his Hurricane at 38 page. Also Sudden Sea, R.A. Scotty. Cherie Burns, The Great Hurricane of 1938. The audio book is sensational, wonderful. And Aram Gutsuzian, The Hurricane of 38. So thank you so much for coming out. And now this is where you give back to me. I'd like to hear some of your stories. Who here, although my young people, was around in 1938 and can actually recall the storm? Yes. What are your recollections?
I remember going home from school after 3 o'clock and seeing the sky yellow and gray, and we felt the warm air. We knew something was going to happen. We were young, but we knew there was something. And I lived in Norwood, and there was a circle of trees that we used to play hide and go seek. And about all of them went down, and I noticed when looking out the window, the tops of the trees were coming touching the ground. The wind was so strong. And we had a tree come out to our front door that fell from across the street. And my father had these knives. Our back door was shaking so bad, and there was a big tree. He stuck the knives in so that the door wouldn't blow open.
Wow. Terrifying, especially for a young girl at that time. Yes?
I was 3 years old at the time. I lived in West Roxbury. I lived on Stimson Street, the first house off of Washington Street, the main Washington Street from Boston, Providence. And my memory is of watching the men come home from work, and they were just blowing around the corner. And it didn't dawn on me till we were watching this that evidently it was all just streetcars and buses for transportation mostly. Not that many people had cars. So the public transportation must have been working for a while. I don't know what time of day that was. It was still light out.
Right. It was about 5:15. Just it hit Providence. 4:30 to the 6 o'clock ranges where it really impacted New England, Boston area. Terrifying. Yes.
I was 10 years old when a hurricane hit. I lived right across from the Grange Hall,
and it had great big pine trees in front of it. They all came down in the road, and we lost 46 panes of glass from the wind alone.
People forget about that. Just your household lost 46 panes of glass. It was a run on glass for just in those big windows. Not anymore. These are even little window panes too. And you had the big windows in those days where you had just basically like those two panes, right?
They were 4 panes.
Oh, 4-pane windows. Wow.
They were big.
Yeah. Wow. Does anybody else have any recollections?
Well, I wanted to say that, well, I'm a historian from Norfolk, one of them. And we had trees in the center of town. We had these trees, and Mr. Carlson built those stores that were there, and he wanted the town to get those trees down. He didn't have to because the storm.
Wow. Wow. So of course, you know, when they do tell you to stay away from the beach, people will go surfing. But you know, if be a clown and you'll drown. The safest defense is not a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread, by the way, against the storm. And just to have some emergency preparedness. If you lose electricity, I don't know if you've ever lost electricity for 12, 24, 36, a week, 36 hours or a week. I mean, we've become so accustomed to electricity, and people can't run out and buy batteries at the height of the storm. So just my advice to you is when you hear a storm, and the meteorologists we're lucky we have a lot of great meteorologists here in Boston area. When they tell you that a storm could hit, you know, heed their advice and just don't go outside, stay indoors, and you know, let the storm pass. But a lot of people get killed in hurricanes when they think the storm's passed and they step outside in the eye. So again, this year here with hurricanes, unprecedented misery and damage, the likes that I've never seen in a hurricane season in the United States dating back to 1620, since the Pilgrims' arrival. So we will get hit one day. Be ready, and God bless. Thank you.